In the second bracha in Bris Amazon, which we are in the middle of, we say, which is the bracha where we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for Eretz Yisroel. Yeshua ben Nun wrote the Nusach HaBracha, thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for Eretz Yisroel. And what do we say? We say, Val brischa shechasamta b'v'sareinu, and for the bris that you were chaysim, that you sealed like a seal in our basar, Val teirascha sheli maditanu, v'achukecha shahidatanu. So what does bris, what does Torah have to do with Eretz Yisroel? So it's interesting, the Gemara Brachas tells us that Nachum HaZakin says, Tzarich shezacher ba bris, that if you don't mention bris in the bracha of Eretz Yisroel, you're not Yaitzer. Rabbi Yossi adds, Tzarich sheyiska ba Torah. You have to mention Torah. If you don't mention Torah in the bracha of Eretz Yisroel, you're not Yaitzer. So why is Bris and Torah to do with Eretz Yisroel? So Rashi gives a very simple explanation on the Gemara. And Rashi says only once Avram Avinu agreed to have a bris milah, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu guarantee him the land of Eretz Yisroel. The land of Eretz Yisroel is dependent on us keeping the mitzvah of bris milah. And as we know, as soon as Yeshua ben Nun got into Eretz Yisroel, what did he have to do? He had to do a bris milah. If you want Eretz Yisroel, it's dependent on bris milah. And not just that, Rashi says, he says we also know the discuses Torah. Shenemar mantichin revisam ubasam v'yushtem esa'aretz, that in order to have the Yerusha of Eretz Yisroel, we must have Torah. And therefore, it's not two independent things that we're thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that in the bracha of Eretz Yisroel, we already thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the mitzvah of bris and for having the Torah, but the two are dependent one on the other. Eretz Yisroel is dependent on Klal Yisrael, keeping the Torah and keeping the mitzvah of bris milah. It's interesting, the Ri Ben Yakar, Rishon, he points out that if you look in Parshas Lech Lecha, in the bracha, in the psukim that talk about the bris milah for Avram and for Yitzchak, the word bris is used 13 times. Keneged the Yud Gimel Midas Shatayr in the Dreshes band. In order for us to learn Torah, we know we have the Yud Gimel Midas, and the Yud Gimel Midas are required for us to be able to understand Torah properly. He says, and bris and Torah are so interchangeable that just like we need the Yud Gimel Midas in order to learn Torah, so too we need a bris to learn Torah. It's a famous Rebbe Kiva Eger who says the same thing, that a person is not a klei kibul to learn Torah until after he has a bris. So one must have a bris, one must have Torah, and then he's ready to have Eretz Yisroel. And one more point, one more Rishon I'll point out, explains. Davud Raham brings Reb Asher Milunil, a Rishon, and he says that it's only in the schus of bris and Torah that we have a kiyum of Eretz Yisroel. That Eretz Yisroel is only mekuyim with bris and Torah. But it's interesting, he's quoting a Gemara in Nedarim Daf Lamed Beis. But in Nedarim Lamed Beis, it's a machlokes whether you need bris for the kiyum of Eretz Yisroel or you need Torah. The Gemara specifically uses the word upligiba, that it's a machlokes. And yet you see that Reb Asher Milunil went and he put it all together. And he tells us that no, that in order for us to have a bracha of Eretz Yisroel, in order for there to be a kiyum of Klal Yisrael and Eretz Yisroel, he takes both shittas, Elu ve'elu divrei lekim chayim, and he tells us we need bris and we need Torah. So we must understand that to have a kiyum of Klal Yisrael and Eretz Yisroel, we need the mitzvah of bris milah, we need to be mekayim it properly, we can't be made for brisai, and everything that goes along with the mitzvah of bris milah, and we must have Torah. It's not two independent things. It's not that in the bracha of Neidel we already thank our HaKadosh Baruch Hu for bris and Torah, but we're recognizing that it's bris and Torah that makes us fit to have the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel and to be zoicha to have Eretz Yisroel.